The fog rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the Maine coastline in a shroud of white. 10-year-old Thomas Benson stood on the rocky shore, his small hand clutched tightly in his father's. The rhythmic pulse of the lighthouse beam, cutting through the swirling mist, was a comforting presence in the growing darkness. "Where's Uncle Arthur?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper above the crashing waves. His father, a man with a charming smile and shifty eyes, squeezed his hand. He's gone away for a while, Tommy. Business, you know." Thomas didn't understand. His Uncle Arthur, the gruff but kind lighthouse keeper, had always been there. He taught Thomas how to tie knots, how to read the weather, how to listen to the stories whispered by the sea. "But he promised to show me the lens," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "The big one, up top." His father's smile faltered, a flicker of something guilt crossing his face. "He'll be back, Tommy," he said, his voice a little too. "He'll be back." But Thomas knew, with a child's intuitive understanding, that something was wrong. Very wrong. His Uncle Arthur wouldn't just leave. Not without saying goodbye. Not without showing him the lens. As they walked away from the lighthouse, the foghorn's mournful bellow echoing in the night, Thomas looked back. The beam, a solitary beacon in the swirling mist, seemed to be searching for something or someone. And Thomas knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his Uncle Arthur wasn't coming back. He had disappeared, swallowed by the fog, by the sea, by the secrets of the lighthouse. Chapter 1. Legacy of Light. Victoria Benson, 55 and a veteran journalist for the Boston Globe, stared at the legal document in her hand, her expression a mixture of disbelief and annoyance. She'd inherited a lighthouse. A lighthouse. From an uncle she barely remembered, a man who had disappeared from her life when she was a child. The letter from the law firm in Port Sentinel, Maine, had arrived out of the blue, a strange twist in a life that had been, until now, relatively predictable. She'd built a career on uncovering truths, on exposing secrets, on navigating the complexities of a human condition. But this was something else entirely. Her father, a con artist who had drifted in and out of her life, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and unpaid debts, had always been vague about his brother, Arthur. "He's different," he'd said, his eyes avoiding hers. "Lives a solitary life. Keeps to himself." Victoria had never understood the estrangement, the unspoken tension that surrounded the mention of her uncle's name. Now, it seemed, she was inheriting his legacy, a legacy shrouded in mystery and wrapped in the salty air of the Maine coast. She glanced at the photograph enclosed with the letter. It showed a weathered, stone lighthouse, perched on a rocky promontory, overlooking a turbulent sea. "Sentinels Light," the caption read. It was a stark, imposing structure, a lonely sentinel against the forces of nature. Victoria's initial instinct was to sell it. Sell it quickly, return to Boston, and forget this odd bequest. She had no interest in lighthouses, in small coastal towns, in the ghosts of a family she barely knew. She had deadlines to meet, stories to write, a life to live. But something held her back. A flicker of curiosity, perhaps. A journalist's innate desire to uncover the truth. A nagging feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye. She booked a flight to Maine, telling herself it was just to assess the property, to make arrangements for its sale. But deep down, she knew she was stepping into a mystery, a puzzle that her estranged uncle had left behind, a puzzle that she, the journalist, the seeker of truth, couldn't resist trying to solve. The legacy wasn't just the lighthouse, it was the unanswered questions that came with it. And those, Victoria knew, were far more compelling than any beam of light. The drive from the small regional airport to Port Sentinel was a journey into another world. The bustling cityscapes of Boston gradually gave way to rolling hills, dense forests, and glimpses of the rugged coastline. The air, thick with the scent of salt and pine, felt different, cleaner, wilder. As Victoria approached Port Sentinel, the lighthouse, Sentinels Light, came into view. It stood tall and imposing on a rocky promontory, a solitary beacon against the vast expanse of the Atlantic. It was even more striking in person than in the photograph, its weathered stone a testament to years of battling the elements. A sense of unease, a prickling of her journalist's instincts, settled over her. This wasn't just a picturesque landmark, it was a place of secrets, a silent witness to untold stories. Port Sentinel itself was a small, quaint town, the kind that time seemed to have forgotten. Fishing boats bobbed in the harbor, lobster traps lined the docks, and weathered clapboard houses clung to the hillsides. The locals, she noticed, eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, their gazes lingering a little too long, their smiles a little too guarded. She checked into a small, locally owned inn, the Seafarer's Rest, its name a promise of respite that she wasn't sure she'd find. The innkeeper, a stout, matronly woman named Martha, gave her a key and a knowing look. "You're Arthur Benson's niece, aren't you?" Martha asked, her voice a low murmur.
Victoria nadie, surprised.
"Yes, I am. Did you know him?" Martha's expression softened, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. "Everyone in Port Sentinel knew Arthur," she said. "He was a good man. A bit of a loner, but a good man." "He disappeared, didn't he?" Victoria asked, the journalist in her unable to resist the question. Martha hesitated, her gaze shifting towards the window, towards the distant silhouette of the lighthouse. "That's what they say," she said, her voice evasive. "Never found him. Just vanished." The conversation left Victoria with more questions than answers. The mystery surrounding her uncle's disappearance, the unspoken secrets that seemed to permeate the town, only deepened her resolve to uncover the truth. The next morning, she drove to the lighthouse. The access road was narrow and winding, clinging precariously to the cliff edge. The wind howled, whipping her hair across her face, and the waves crashed against the rocks below, a constant reminder of the raw power of the sea. The lighthouse itself was in a state of disrepair. The paint was peeling, the windows were grimy, and the metal railings were rusted. The door, a heavy oak affair, was secured with a rusty padlock. Victoria fumbled with the key the lawyer had provided, her hands cold and stiff. Finally, the lock clicked open, and she pushed the door inward, a gust of musty air greeting her. The interior was dark and damp, the silence broken only by the creaking of the structure and the distant roar of the ocean. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through the grimy windows. She stepped inside, her senses on high alert. The air was thick with the scent of salt, mildew, and something else, something indefinable, a hint of something old, something forgotten. It was the smell of secrets. She felt a chill run down her spine, a premonition of the mysteries that lay hidden within these stone walls. This wasn't just a building, it was a character, a silent participant in whatever drama had unfolded here. And Victoria, the journalist, the inheritor of this strange legacy, was about to become a part of its story. She just didn't know how dangerous that story would be. Chapter 2. Unwelcome guests. Victoria spent the rest of the day exploring the lighthouse. The ground floor consisted of a small, sparsely furnished living area, a kitchen with antiquated appliances, and a narrow, winding staircase that led to the upper levels. The walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty books, nautical charts, and an assortment of odd objects, seashells, pieces of driftwood, and strange, unidentifiable tools. As she climbed the staircase, the air grew colder, the scent of salt and mildew more intense. The second floor housed a small bedroom with a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a single window overlooking the sea. The view was breathtaking, a panoramic vista of the rugged coastline and the turbulent Atlantic. But Victoria couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense that she was being watched, that she wasn't alone. The top floor, of course, was the lantern room, the heart of a lighthouse. The massive Fresnel lens, a complex array of prisms and glass, dominated the space. It was a magnificent piece of engineering, a testament to human ingenuity and the enduring need to guide ships safely through treacherous waters. Victoria ran her hand over the cold, smooth glass, feeling a connection to her uncle, to the solitary life he had led, to the responsibility he had carried. She wondered what had driven him to this remote place, what secrets he had kept, what had led to his mysterious disappearance. As dusk began to settle, Victoria decided to head back to the inn. She secured the lighthouse door, double-checking the padlock, and started her car. As she drove down the winding access road, she noticed a pair of headlights in her rearview mirror, following her at a distance. She initially dismissed it, assuming it was just another local. But as she reached the main road, the headlights remained behind her, their presence a nagging concern. She sped up slightly, and the other car did the same. A sense of unease, bordering on fear, crept over her. This wasn't just a coincidence. Someone was following her. She reached the outskirts of Port Sentinel, her heart pounding, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She considered driving to the sheriff's office, but she didn't even know where it was. And she didn't want to appear paranoid, to overreact. Instead, she pulled into the parking lot of the Seafarer's Rest, hoping that the presence of other people would deter whoever was following her. She parked her car, quickly got out, and hurried inside, locking the door behind her. She peered through the window, her breath catching in her throat. The car that had been following her, a dark-colored sedan with tinted windows, was parked across the street, its engine idling. She couldn't see who was inside, but she knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were watching her. Martha, the innkeeper, emerged from the back room, her expression concerned.
Victoria?
Are you all right? You look pale. Victoria forced a smile, trying to appear calm. I think someone was following me, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Martha's eyes widened. She glanced out the window, her gaze lingering on the dark sedan. Stay here, she said, her voice firm. I'll call Graham. Victoria didn't ask who Graham was. She was just grateful for Martha's presence, for her calm demeanor, for the sense of safety that the small inn provided. But she knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The secrets of Sentinel's light were starting to surface, and someone, it seemed, was determined to keep them buried. And she, the unwelcome inheritor, was now caught in the middle of it all. The unwelcome guests weren't just in the lighthouse, they were outside it, too. And they were watching. Chapter 3, Shadows and Suspicions. Martha returned a few minutes later, her expression grim.
Graham's on his way, she said.
He's the sheriff's deputy. He'll know what to do. Victoria nodded, her heart still pounding. She tried to calm herself, to think rationally, to approach the situation like a journalist, gathering information, assessing the facts. But fear, a primal, instinctive fear, kept creeping in, clouding her judgment. The wait for Graham seemed to stretch on forever. Victoria paced the small lobby of the inn, her gaze constantly drawn to the window, to the dark sedan that remained parked across the street. The shadows of the evening deepened, the town growing quieter, the sense of isolation and vulnerability intensifying. Finally, a pickup truck with the words Port Sentinel Sheriff's Department emblazoned on the side pulled up in front of the inn. A man emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and kind eyes. He wore the uniform of a sheriff's deputy, but there was a weariness about him, a hint of sadness that lingered in his gaze. This was Graham. Martha introduced them, explaining the situation, her voice tight with concern. Graham listened patiently, his eyes fixed on Victoria, assessing her, gauging her fear. You said you were followed? He asked, his voice calm and reassuring. Victoria nodded, recounting the events of the evening, her voice still trembling slightly. She described the dark sedan, the tinted windows, the feeling of being watched. Graham glanced out the window, but the sedan was gone. The street was empty, the shadows undisturbed. Did you get a license plate number? He asked. Victoria shook her head. No, it was too dark. And I was panicked. Graham sighed, running a hand through his short, graying hair.
It's all right, he said.
You did the right thing coming here. He asked her a few more questions about her uncle, about the lighthouse, about any possible reason why someone might want to follow her. Victoria answered as best she could, but she realized how little she knew, how much she still had to learn. I'll take a look around, Graham said. See if I can find that sedan. In the meantime, stay here.
Don't go anywhere alone.
He paused, his gaze softening slightly. Port Sentinel is usually a quiet town, he said. But sometimes things happen. Old secrets, they have a way of surfacing. His words sent a shiver down Victoria's spine. He knew that there was more to this story than a simple case of mistaken identity or random harassment. He knew that the secrets of Sentinel's light were somehow connected to her uncle, to the dark sedan that had followed her. After Graham left, Martha made Victoria a cup of strong tea, urging her to sit down and relax. But relaxation was impossible. Victoria's mind was racing, her journalist's instincts on high alert. She was determined to uncover the truth, to find out who was following her and why. But she also knew that she was in over her head, that she needed help. And she had a feeling that Graham, the weary sheriff's deputy with the kind eyes and the hint of sadness, was the only one who could provide it. The shadows weren't just outside, they were inside her, too, the shadows of doubt, of fear, of a past she didn't fully understand. And those shadows were just as dangerous as the ones lurking in the dark streets of Port Sentinel. Chapter 4. The sheriff's deputy Victoria spent a restless night at the Seafarer's Rest, tossing and turning, her mind replaying the events of the evening, her fear amplified by the unfamiliar surroundings and the unsettling silence of the small town. Every creak of the old building, every rustle of the wind, sounded like an intruder, a threat lurking just outside her door. The next morning, she found Graham waiting for her in the inn's small dining room. He was sitting at a table by the window, a cup of coffee in his hand, his gaze fixed on the street outside. He looked up as she approached, a faint smile touching his lips. "Morning," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Sleep well?" Victoria shook her head, managing a weak smile.
Not really, she admitted.
He gestured for her to sit down.
I didn't find the sedan, he said.
But I talked to a few people. No one saw anything suspicious. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. I also did some digging on your uncle, Arthur Benson, he continued. His disappearance, it was a big deal back then. The sheriff's office investigated, but they never found any evidence of foul play. It was like he just vanished. Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. The same words, the same mystery, echoing through the years. Do you think he's still alive?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Graham hesitated, his expression thoughtful. "It's been a long time," he said. "But anything's possible. People disappear. Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they don't." He leaned forward, his voice lowering slightly. "I also found out something else," he said. "Your uncle, he had a reputation for being secretive, for keeping to himself, and for being involved in things that weren't quite legal." Victoria's eyes widened. "What kind of things?" she asked. Graham shrugged, his expression noncommittal. "Rumors, mostly. Smuggling. Running contraband. Nothing was ever proven. But in a small town, rumors have a way of sticking." The information was unsettling, confirming her suspicions that her uncle's life was far more complex, far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. It also added another layer to the mystery, another possible reason why someone might want to scare her away, to prevent her from uncovering the truth. It was her father who was the con artist, not her uncle. This new information cast everything in a different light. "I need to go back to the lighthouse," Victoria said, her voice firm. "There has to be something there. Something that will explain all this." Graham nodded, understanding. "I'll go with you," he said. "It's not safe for you to be there alone." His offer was both reassuring and unsettling. She was grateful for his protection, for his presence, but she also recognized the danger, the risk that they were both taking. As they drove to the lighthouse, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being followed. She glanced in the rearview mirror, scanning the road behind them, but she saw nothing. It was as if the shadows themselves were concealing her pursuers, hiding their identities, their motives, their connection to the secrets of Sentinel's light. The sheriff's deputy wasn't just a protector, he was a fellow investigator, a partner in this increasingly dangerous quest for the truth. And Victoria, despite her fear, was starting to feel a flicker of something else, a grudging respect, a growing trust, a sense of connection to this man who had so unexpectedly, become her ally. Chapter 5. Whispers in the dark. The lighthouse stood stark and imposing against the gray morning sky, the wind whipping around it, the waves crashing against the rocks below. The sense of isolation, of vulnerability, was even more pronounced than before, amplified by the knowledge that someone was actively trying to intimidate Victoria. Graham parked his truck near the entrance, his gaze sweeping over the area, assessing any potential threats. He carried himself with a quiet authority, a confidence that came from years of experience, but Victoria could sense the underlying tension, the awareness that they were stepping into a potentially dangerous situation. They entered the lighthouse, the musty air hitting Victoria with a renewed force. The silence, broken only by the creaking of the structure and the distant roar of the ocean, was heavy, oppressive. "Where do you want to start?" Graham asked, his voice low.
Victoria Geshetati.
She'd already explored the lighthouse, but she'd done it alone, without the benefit of Graham's perspective of his law enforcement experience. "The living area, I guess," she said. "Maybe there's something I missed. A clue, a note, anything." They began searching the ground floor, systematically examining every object, every piece of furniture, every nook and cranny. Graham, with his trained eye, noticed details that Victoria had overlooked: a faint scratch on the floor, a loose floorboard, a smudge on the wall that might have been a fingerprint. As they were searching, they heard a noise. A faint creak coming from upstairs. Graham froze, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Victoria nodded, her heart pounding. "Yes," she said. "Someone's here." They moved silently towards the staircase, Graham leading the way, his gun drawn. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation and fear. They reached the second floor, the bedroom, the source of the noise. The window, which Victoria had closed the previous day, was now slightly ajar, the wind whistling through the gap. Graham approached the window cautiously, his gun raised. He peered outside, scanning the rocky coastline, but saw nothing. "False alarm," he said, his voice still tense. "Just the wind." But Victoria wasn't convinced. She walked over to the window, examining the frame. There were fresh scratches on the wood, marks that hadn't been there before. Someone had been here. Someone had been inside the lighthouse, while they were searching downstairs. "Graham," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Look at this." He joined her at the window, his eyes following hers to the scratches on the frame. He frowned, his expression grim. "You're right," he said. "Someone was here, and they were trying to get in or out." The realization sent a shiver down Victoria's spine. This wasn't just about scaring her away, it was about something more. Something hidden within the lighthouse, something that someone was desperately trying to find or to protect. The whispers in the dark weren't just the wind, they were the echoes of a past that refused to stay silent, a past that was now threatening to engulf them both. And Victoria knew that they were running out of time. They needed to find the truth, before the truth found them. Chapter 6. Storm warning. The discovery of the fresh scratches on the window frame heightened the tension, confirming Victoria's fear that they were dealing with something more than just random harassment. Someone had been inside the lighthouse, and they were likely still looking for something. "We need to search this place thoroughly," Graham said, his voice low and urgent. "Every inch. There has to be something here, something your uncle hid." They continued their search, moving with a renewed sense of urgency, their senses on high alert. They examined the bedroom more closely, checking under the bed, inside the chest, behind the curtains. They found nothing. They moved to the lantern room, the top floor of the lighthouse. The massive Fresnel lens, with its intricate array of prisms and glass, dominated the space. The view from the top was breathtaking, but Victoria couldn't appreciate it. Her mind was focused on the task at hand, on finding whatever it was that her uncle had hidden, whatever it was that someone was so desperate to find. Graham examined the lens itself, running his hands over the cold, smooth glass, checking for any hidden compartments, any loose panels.
He found nothing.
"There has to be something else," Victoria said, her voice frustrated. "A hidden room, a secret passage, something." She remembered her uncle's words, or rather, her father's description of him. He's different. Lives a solitary life. Keeps to himself. A man who kept to himself, who lived a solitary life, he would have secrets. And he would have a place to hide them. She looked around the lantern room again, her gaze sweeping over the walls, the floor, the ceiling. And then she saw it. A small, almost imperceptible irregularity in the floorboards, near the base of the lens. "Graham," she said, pointing to the spot.
Look.
He knelt down, examining the floorboards. He pressed on one of them, and it moved slightly, revealing a narrow gap. "Good eye, Victoria," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. He carefully lifted the floorboard, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside, there was a wooden box, old and weathered, bound with iron straps. Their hearts pounded in unison. This was it. This was what they had been looking for. They carefully lifted the box out of the compartment. It was heavy, surprisingly so. Graham placed it on the floor, and they looked at each other, a silent acknowledgement of the significance of the moment. As they were about to open the box, they heard a noise outside. The unmistakable sound of an engine, approaching fast. Graham quickly moved to the window, peering out. "It's a boat," he said, his voice urgent. Coming towards the lighthouse. Victoria joined him at the window. A small, powerful speedboat was racing across the water, heading directly towards the rocky promontory where the lighthouse stood. She couldn't see who was on board, but she knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were not friendly. "We're trapped," she said, her voice filled with fear. Graham's expression was grim.
Not yet, he said.
"But we need to get out of here.
Now."
The storm warning wasn't just about the weather, it was about the impending confrontation, the clash between those seeking the truth and those determined to keep it buried. And Victoria and Graham were caught in the middle, trapped in a lighthouse with a secret that someone was willing to kill for. Chapter 7. Trapped. The roar of the approaching speedboat echoed through the lighthouse, a menacing sound that amplified their sense of isolation and vulnerability. Victoria and Graham exchanged a look, a silent understanding of the danger they were in. "We need to get out of here," Graham repeated, his voice urgent. Before they reached the shore, he grabbed the wooden box from the floor, its weight a tangible reminder of the secrets it contained. "Come on," he said, heading towards the staircase. They descended the winding stairs as quickly as they could, the narrow confines of the lighthouse making their escape feel even more desperate. The sound of the speedboat grew louder, closer, the threat more imminent. They reached the ground floor, rushing towards the main entrance. But as Graham reached for the door, they heard another sound, the crunch of footsteps on gravel, outside the lighthouse. They were too late. Someone had already landed. Graham pulled Victoria behind him, shielding her with his body. He drew his gun, his expression grim, his eyes fixed on the door. "Stay behind me," he whispered. "And be quiet." The doorknob turned, slowly, deliberately. The heavy oak door creaked open, revealing a figure silhouetted against the gray morning light. It was a man, tall and muscular, with a hard face and cold eyes. He held a gun in his hand, pointed directly at them. "Well, well," the man said, his voice a low growl. "Look what we have here." The nosy journalist and the washed-up deputy. Victoria felt a surge of fear, but also a flicker of defiance. She recognized the man's voice. It was the same voice she'd heard on the phone, the anonymous caller who had warned her to leave Oakhaven.
"Who are you?"
she demanded, her voice trembling slightly.
"And what do you want?"
The man chuckled, a humorless sound. "What I want," he said, "is that box. The one you're holding." He stepped inside the lighthouse, his gun trained on Graham.
"Hand it over," he said.
"And maybe I'll let you live." Graham's grip tightened on his gun. He didn't speak, his eyes locked on the intruder, assessing the situation, calculating his options. Victoria knew that they were in a desperate situation. They were outnumbered, outgunned, trapped in a remote lighthouse with a man who was clearly willing to use violence. But she also knew that they couldn't give up. They couldn't let this man, whoever he was, get away with the secrets contained in that box. Secrets that her uncle had protected, secrets that someone was willing to kill for. "We're not giving you anything," Victoria said, her voice surprisingly steady. The man's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, his gun unwavering.
"Don't be stupid," he said.
"This isn't worth dying for." Graham shifted his position slightly, trying to create an opening, a chance to disarm the intruder. But the man was too quick, too alert. "Don't even think about it, Deputy," the man said, his voice cold and menacing. "I'll shoot you both where you stand." The standoff continued, the tension thick in the air, the silence broken only by the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks outside and the pounding of their hearts. They were trapped, caught in a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the secrets of Sentinels light hanging in the balance. And Victoria knew that their lives and the truth depended on their next move. Chapter 8. The Lighthouse Keeper's Log. As the standoff in the lighthouse continued, Victoria's mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to gain the upper hand. The intruder, clearly intent on getting the box, had them cornered. Direct confrontation seemed impossible. She needed a distraction, something to shift the balance of power. Her gaze fell on the wooden box Graham was still clutching. The contents were the key. If she could get the intruder to reveal why he wanted the box, perhaps she could use that information to her advantage. "What's in the box?" Victoria asked, her voice loud and clear, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "What are you so afraid of us finding?" The man's eyes flickered, a momentary hesitation that betrayed his surprise at her question. He clearly hadn't expected her to be so direct. "That's none of your concern," he growled, his grip tightening on his gun. "It is my concern," Victoria insisted. "It's my uncle's property. And you're threatening us with a gun. I think I have a right to know." The man hesitated again, his eyes darting between Victoria and Graham. He seemed to be calculating, weighing his options. It's just some old papers," he finally said, his voice unconvincing. "Nothing important." "Then why are you so desperate to get it?"
Victoria pressed.
"Why threaten us? Why break into the lighthouse?" The man's composure began to crack. He shifted his weight, his eyes flickering nervously. Just hand it over," he stammered. "And no one gets hurt." Graham, sensing an opportunity, spoke for the first time since the intruder had entered. "We know about your uncle, Victoria," Graham said, his voice calm and steady, his eyes fixed on the intruder. "We know about the smuggling. Is that what this is about? Drugs? Money?" The man's face paled. He clearly hadn't expected them to know about that. I don't know what you're talking about," he mumbled, his voice losing its conviction. Victoria seized the moment. "Don't lie to us," she said, her voice rising. "We know your uncle was involved in something illegal. And we think you are too. What's in the box, really?" The man's resolve crumbled. He lowered his gun slightly, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. It's a logbook," he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "My uncle's logbook. He kept records. Of everything. A logbook." The realization hit Victoria like a bolt of lightning. A lighthouse keeper's logbook. It wouldn't just contain weather reports and maintenance records, it would contain everything that had happened at the lighthouse, everything her uncle had seen, everything he had done, including, perhaps, the details of his illegal activities and the identity of his accomplices. "And you're afraid of what's in it," Graham said, his voice firm. "Because it implicates you, doesn't it?" The man didn't answer. He just stood there, his gun hanging loosely at his side, his eyes filled with defeat. The distraction had worked. The balance of power had shifted. But the danger wasn't over yet. They still needed to get out of the lighthouse, to get the logbook to safety, to expose the truth. The lighthouse keeper's log was more than just a record of the past, it was the key to unlocking the present, and potentially, a very dangerous future. Chapter 9. Secrets unveiled. With the intruder disarmed, both literally and figuratively, by the revelation of the logbook's existence, Graham quickly moved to secure him. He disarmed the man, a swift and efficient maneuver honed by years of experience, and forced him to sit on the floor, his hands behind his back. "Don't even think about moving," Graham warned, his voice cold and authoritative. He then turned to Victoria.
Call the sheriff's office, he said.
Tell them we have an intruder, armed and dangerous. And tell them we need backup.
Now.
Victoria quickly pulled out her phone and dialed, her hands trembling slightly. She relayed the information to the dispatcher, her voice urgent, emphasizing the need for immediate assistance. While they waited for backup to arrive, Graham kept a watchful eye on the intruder, who remained silent, his face a mask of sullen resignation. Victoria, her journalist's instincts kicking in, couldn't resist the urge to question him.
Who are you?
She asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Why were you so desperate to get that logbook? The man refused to answer, his gaze fixed on the floor. We know about your uncle's smuggling operation, Victoria continued, pressing him. Were you involved? Is that why you wanted the logbook? To destroy the evidence? The man finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and defiance. My name's Carl, he said, his voice grudging. Carl Weaver. And my uncle, he wasn't a smuggler. He was framed. Victoria and Graham exchanged a look. This was a new twist, a claim that contradicted everything they had heard so far. Framed? Graham asked, his voice skeptical. By whom? Carl hesitated, his gaze flickering nervously. I don't know, he said. But the logbook, it has the proof. It has the names of the real criminals. He paused, his voice lowering slightly. My uncle, he was a good man. He wouldn't hurt anyone. He was just trying to protect himself. And he was protecting someone else. Victoria's curiosity was piqued. This was a far more complex story than she had initially imagined. It wasn't just about smuggling, it was about betrayal, about hidden identities, about a web of deceit that stretched back years. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the tension, signaling the arrival of the backup. Graham secured Carl, and they waited for the other deputies to arrive. Once the situation was under control, and Carl Weaver was taken into custody, Graham turned to Victoria. We need to look at that logbook, he said, his voice serious. It's the key to everything. They carefully opened the wooden box, revealing the leather-bound logbook. It was old and worn, its pages filled with faded ink, a record of a life lived in solitude, a life shrouded in secrets. They began to read, slowly, carefully, deciphering the cryptic entries, piecing together the fragments of a past that was now threatening to disrupt the present. The secrets of Sentinels' light were finally being unveiled, and Victoria knew that their lives, and the lives of many others in Port Sentinel, would never be the same. The logbook wasn't just a record of events, it was a map, a guide to a hidden truth that had been buried for far too long. And they were about to unearth it, one page at a time. Chapter 10. Buried Truths. Helen and Graham sat at the small table in the diner's kitchen, the lighthouse keeper's logbook open before them. The faded ink and cramped handwriting made it difficult to decipher, but they slowly, painstakingly, began to piece together the story it told. The early entries were mundane, recording weather conditions, ship sightings, and routine maintenance tasks. But as they moved further into the logbook, the entries became more cryptic, more personal, more revealing. Arthur Benson had clearly been a lonely man, haunted by secrets, burdened by a responsibility he couldn't share. He wrote of his love for the sea, his respect for the power of the lighthouse, his growing unease about the visitors who came to the island at night, under the cover of darkness. He never mentioned their names, referring to them only as the shadows or the night birds. But he documented their activities, their clandestine meetings, their hushed conversations, the heavy crates they carried on and off their boats. He wrote of his growing suspicion that these men were involved in something illegal, something dangerous. He wrestled with his conscience, torn between his duty to report them and his fear of the consequences. Then they found it, a series of entries, written in a frantic, almost illegible hand, that detailed a specific incident. A night when a storm raged, when a ship foundered on the rocks, when Arthur Benson witnessed something that changed his life forever. He wrote of seeing men, the shadows, pulling survivors from the wreckage, not to rescue them, but to silence them. He wrote of seeing crates, washed ashore from the ship, filled not with contraband, but with something far more valuable and far more dangerous. He wrote of his decision to hide those crates, to protect them from the shadows, to keep their secret safe. He didn't specify what was in the crates, or where he had hidden them. But he wrote of his fear, his growing paranoia, his certainty that his life was in danger. The final entry was abrupt, unfinished. It simply read, "They know. They're coming. God help me." Helen and Graham looked at each other, their faces pale, their hearts pounding. They had found the truth, or at least a part of it. Arthur Benson hadn't been a smuggler. He had been a witness to a crime that had been covered up, a crime that someone was still desperately trying to keep secret. "He was murdered, wasn't he?" Victoria said, her voice barely a whisper. Graham nodded, his expression grim.
"It looks that way," he said.
And Carl Weaver, he was right. His uncle was framed. But the logbook raised more questions than it answered. Who were the shadows? What was in the crates? And where had Arthur Benson hidden them? "We need to find those crates, Helen," Graham said, his voice urgent. "They're the key to solving this mystery. And they might still be in danger." The danger mentioned was twofold. Whoever the shadows were and whatever was in the crates themselves. They knew that they were running out of time. The secrets of Sentinels' light were unraveling, and the people responsible for Arthur Benson's death, the people who had framed him, were still out there. And they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. The buried truths weren't just about the past, they were about the present, about a danger that was very real, very immediate. And Helen and Graham were now caught in the middle of it all, armed only with a logbook and their determination to uncover the truth. Chapter 11. Redemption's price. The revelation that Arthur Benson had been murdered, and that his logbook pointed to a conspiracy far greater than simple smuggling, spurred Helen and Graham into action. They knew they needed to find the crates Arthur had hidden, not only to clear his name, but also to bring the true criminals to justice. They returned to the lighthouse, the logbook their guide, their determination fueled by a sense of urgency and a growing understanding of the danger they faced. They reread the final entries, searching for any clue, any hint that Arthur might have left about the location of the hidden crates. He had written about the storm, about the ship foundering on the rocks, about the shadows silencing the survivors. He had written about his fear, his paranoia, his certainty that his life was in danger. But he hadn't written about where he had hidden the crates. Helen, with her journalist's eye for detail, noticed something that Graham, with his law enforcement focus, had missed. In one of the entries, Arthur had described the storm, using a specific nautical term, a nor'easter, blowing fierce, a true widow-maker. "Graham," she said, her voice excited, "this term, widow-maker. It's not just a description of the storm. It's a name. A local name for a specific place." Graham's eyes widened. He grabbed his phone, quickly searching for the term. He found it. "Widow's Cove," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "It's a small, secluded cove about a mile south of here. It's known for its treacherous currents, its hidden rocks. It's where a lot of ships have met their end." It made sense. Arthur, knowing the coastline intimately, would have chosen a place that was both hidden and difficult to access. A place where the sea itself would help to conceal his secret. They drove to Widow's Cove, the winding road clinging precariously to the cliff edge. The cove was a dramatic, almost forbidding place, with jagged rocks, crashing waves, and a sense of isolation that sent a shiver down Victoria's spine. They searched the area, carefully examining every nook and cranny, every crevice in the rocks. The tide was low, revealing hidden pools and treacherous underwater channels. Finally, after hours of searching, Graham found it. A small, almost imperceptible opening in the cliff face, concealed behind a curtain of seaweed. "Helen," he called, his voice filled with excitement. "Over here." They carefully made their way to the opening, their hearts pounding with anticipation. It was a narrow crevice, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Graham used his flashlight to illuminate the interior. It was a small cave, its walls damp and slick, the air thick with the smell of salt and decay. And there, stacked against the far wall, were the crates. They were old and weathered, their wood rotting, their metal straps rusted. But they were there. The evidence that Arthur Benson had hidden, the evidence that could expose the truth, the evidence that could finally bring justice to his memory. But as they were about to retrieve the crates, they heard a noise. A footstep on the rocks outside the cave. They froze, their hearts pounding. They were not alone. Graham quickly switched off his flashlight, plunging the cave into darkness. He moved to the entrance, his gun drawn, his body tense and alert. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice firm. There was no answer. Only the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks, and the whisper of the wind. The redemption's price wasn't just about uncovering the truth, it was about facing the danger that came with it. And Victoria and Graham, trapped in a hidden cove with the evidence that could expose a decades-old conspiracy, were about to pay that price. The past wasn't just haunting them, it was hunting them. Chapter 12. Confrontation. The silence following Graham's shout was broken only by the relentless pounding of the waves against the rocks. Victoria held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs, every nerve on high alert. Graham stood poised at the cave entrance, a silhouette against the faint light filtering in from outside, his gun a stark extension of his tense posture. After what felt like an eternity, a voice, rough and laced with menace, cut through the air.
"Come on out, deputy.
And bring the journalist with you. And the crates, of course." Graham didn't respond, his eyes scanning the rocks outside, trying to pinpoint the speaker's location. Victoria, her fear battling with a surge of adrenaline-fueled defiance, recognized the voice. It was the same one she'd heard on the phone, the same one that had belonged to Carl Weaver, the man who claimed his uncle had been framed. But Weaver was in custody. This couldn't be him. "Who are you?" Graham called out, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Show yourself." A chuckle, cold and devoid of humor, answered him. "You know who I am, Graham. Or, at least, you should. I'm the one you couldn't catch. The one who got away." Graham's body stiffened, a subtle shift that Victoria didn't miss. He did know the voice. A memory, a ghost from his past, had materialized. "Sheriff Buckley," Graham said, his voice low and tight, the name a mixture of disbelief and a dawning horror. The figure stepped out from behind a large rock, revealing himself in the fading light. He was an older man, his face weathered and lined, but his eyes held a sharp, calculating intelligence. He was dressed in casual clothes, but there was an air of authority about him, the unmistakable bearing of a man used to command. And he held a gun, aimed steadily at the cave entrance. "That's right, Graham," Buckley said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "Surprised? I always told you. You weren't cut out for this job. Too soft. Too trusting." Victoria's mind reeled. The former sheriff? The man who had supposedly investigated Arthur Benson's disappearance? It was almost too much to comprehend. "You killed him," Graham said, his voice a low growl, the accusation heavy with years of suppressed anger and grief. "You killed Arthur. And you framed Carl Weaver's uncle." Buckley smiled, a chilling, predatory smile.
"Arthur saw too much," he said.
He was a liability. And as for Weaver, well, he was convenient. A patsy. "What was in those crates, Buckley?" Victoria demanded, her voice shaking but firm. "What was worth killing for?" Buckley's smile widened. "Let's just say," he said, "it was something that certain people in high places didn't want exposed. Something that would have ruined careers, destroyed reputations, and cost a lot of money." He gestured with his gun towards the cave. "Now, bring those crates out here. And let's end this." Quietly. Graham didn't move. He was trapped, his options severely limited. But Victoria knew he wouldn't give up, wouldn't surrender without a fight. The confrontation wasn't just about the crates, about the secrets they contained. It was about justice, about redemption, about facing the demons of the past. And as the waves crashed against the rocks and the wind howled around them, Victoria knew that the final battle for the truth, for Sentinel's light, had begun. The price of that truth, however, was about to become terrifyingly clear. Chapter 13. Aftermath. The standoff at Widow's Cove reached its climax with a sudden, violent burst of action. Graham, seeing an opportunity when Buckley shifted his attention momentarily to Victoria, lunged forward, tackling the former sheriff to the ground. The gun went off, the shot echoing through the cove, the sound swallowed by the crashing waves. Victoria screamed, her heart leaping into her throat, unsure who had been hit. A struggle ensued, a desperate grapple for control of the weapon. Graham, despite his age, was strong and determined, fueled by years of pent-up anger and a fierce desire for justice. Buckley, however, was equally determined, driven by a desperate need to protect his secrets, to escape the consequences of his actions. Finally, with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, Graham managed to disarm Buckley, pinning him to the ground, his gun pressed against the older man's temple. "It's over, Buckley," Graham said, his voice ragged, his breath coming in gasps. "It's finally over." Buckley glared up at him, his eyes filled with hatred and defeat. He didn't speak, his silence a tacit admission of guilt. Victoria, her legs trembling, rushed to Graham's side, checking to see if he was injured. He had a graze on his arm, where the bullet had grazed him, but otherwise, he seemed unharmed. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. He nodded, his gaze still fixed on Buckley. "I'm fine," he said, "just a little shaken." They secured Buckley, using his own belt and shoelaces to bind his hands and feet. Then, they waited for the backup to arrive, the silence broken only by the sound of the waves and the ragged breathing of the two men. The aftermath of the confrontation was a blur of activity. The current sheriff, a young, earnest woman named Deputy Hayes, arrived with several other deputies, their faces grim, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. Buckley, their former boss, the man who had once commanded their respect, was now a prisoner, his crimes exposed, his legacy shattered. The crates were retrieved from the cave, their contents carefully examined. They contained not drugs or money, as Graham had initially suspected, but documents. Papers, photographs, and recordings that detailed a complex conspiracy involving illegal land deals, political corruption, and environmental destruction. Buckley, along with several other prominent figures in the state, had been involved in a scheme to develop the pristine coastline of Maine, using illegal methods, silencing anyone who stood in their way. Arthur Benson, the solitary lighthouse keeper, had stumbled upon their secret, had witnessed their crimes, and had paid the ultimate price. Carl Weaver's uncle had been framed, a convenient scapegoat to divert attention from the true criminals. The news of Buckley's arrest and the uncovering of the conspiracy sent shockwaves through Port Sentinel and beyond. The secrets of Sentinel's light, buried for decades, had finally come to light, bringing justice to the dead and exposing the corruption of the living. Victoria, as a journalist, played a crucial role in bringing the story to the public, her articles in the Boston Globe detailing the events, exposing the players, and demanding accountability. She wrote with a passion and a personal investment that she had rarely felt before, her words a tribute to Arthur Benson, to Carl Weaver's uncle, to the truth that had finally been revealed. The aftermath wasn't just about justice, it was about healing, about confronting the past, about rebuilding trust. And for Victoria and Graham, it was about something more. A bond forged in danger, a connection deepened by shared experience, a love that had blossomed in the most unexpected of circumstances. The storm had passed, but the calm that followed was filled with the promise of a new beginning, a future free from the shadows of the past. Chapter 14. Broken Trust. The arrest of former Sheriff Buckley and the subsequent unraveling of the conspiracy sent ripples of shock and disbelief throughout Port Sentinel. The town, once a picture of quiet coastal charm, was now grappling with the uncomfortable truth of betrayal and corruption within its own ranks. Trust, the bedrock of any small community, had been shattered. For Graham, the revelation that his former mentor, the man he had respected and admired, was a criminal, was a particularly bitter pill to swallow. He felt a deep sense of personal betrayal, a sense of having been naive, of having failed to see the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. He questioned his own judgment, his own ability to assess character, his own fitness for the job he had dedicated his life to. Victoria, watching Graham struggle with his emotions, felt a surge of empathy and understanding. She knew what it was like to have your trust broken, to have your faith in someone you respected shattered. Her own father's deceitful life had taught her that lesson early on. She tried to offer him comfort, to reassure him that he wasn't to blame, that he couldn't have known the truth. But Graham remained withdrawn, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a brooding silence, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and self-reproach. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch of her now their rented house, overlooking the harbor, Victoria tried to reach out to him. "Graham," she said, her voice gentle, "you can't blame yourself for this. You couldn't have known." He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the sky met the sea. "He fooled everyone," Victoria continued. "He was a master manipulator. You weren't the only one." Graham finally turned to her, his eyes filled with a pain that cut her to the core. "I should have seen it, Victoria," he said, his voice hoarse. "I should have known. I was a deputy, for God's sake. It was my job to see through the lies, to protect the innocent." "You did your job, Graham," Victoria said, her voice firm. "You caught him. You brought him to justice. You avenged Arthur Benson's murder." He shook his head, his expression filled with self-doubt.
"It was too late," he said.
"Arthur was already dead. And Carl Weaver's uncle, he spent years in prison for a crime he didn't commit." Victoria reached out, taking his hand in hers. His touch was cold, his grip weak. "It's not too late to make things right, Graham," she said. "You can help clear Weaver's uncle's name. You can help rebuild trust in this community. You can start over." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if looking for an answer, for a way out of the darkness that had enveloped him. "I don't know if I can, Victoria," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I feel like I've lost my way." Victoria squeezed his hand, her heart aching for him. She knew that the road to healing, to rebuilding trust, would be long and difficult. But she also knew that she couldn't give up on him, that she wouldn't give up on him. The broken trust wasn't just about the community, it was about Graham's trust in himself, in his own judgment, in his own ability to do good. And Victoria, the woman who had once been so wary of trust, was now determined to help him find his way back, to help him heal, to help him rediscover the faith in himself that he had lost. She had come to Maine seeking to escape her past. She was staying because she had found a future. And that future was inextricably linked to this man, this community, and the broken trust that they now needed to mend together. Chapter 15. The weight of silence. Graham's internal struggle continued, the weight of Buckley's betrayal pressing down on him, casting a long shadow over his spirit. He became withdrawn, isolating himself from Victoria and the community, spending hours alone, walking the coastline, staring out at the sea, as if searching for answers in the turbulent waves. Victoria, concerned and increasingly frustrated by his emotional distance, tried to reach out to him, to offer her support, to remind him of the good he had done, of the justice he had brought. But her words seemed to bounce off him, unable to penetrate the wall of self-doubt and guilt he had erected around himself. One evening, as they were sitting in silence in the living room of their rented house, Victoria decided to try a different approach. Instead of offering comfort, she challenged him. "Graham," she said, her voice firm but gentle, "you're wallowing. You're letting Buckley win, even now. He's destroyed your faith in yourself, and you're letting him." Graham looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "What do you want me to do, Victoria?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Just pretend it didn't happen? Pretend I didn't trust the man who murdered Arthur Benson?" "No," Victoria said. "I want you to acknowledge it, to accept it, and then to move on, to learn from it, to use it to become a better man, a better deputy." She paused, her gaze softening slightly. "You're not responsible for Buckley's actions, Graham," she said. "You're responsible for your own. And right now, you're choosing to let this consume you." Her words seemed to hit home. Graham flinched slightly, his expression shifting from anger to something else. Shame? Regret? He looked away, his gaze fixed on the floor. I don't know how, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Victoria reached out, taking his hand in hers. His touch was still cold, but she felt a flicker of response, a slight tightening of his grip. You start by talking to me, she said. By telling me what you're feeling. By letting me in. He hesitated, his internal struggle evident. The weight of silence, the burden of his unspoken emotions, was a heavy load to bear. Finally, he spoke, his voice halting, his words raw and vulnerable. I feel like I failed, he said. I failed Arthur. I failed Carl Weaver's uncle. I failed this community. He looked at Victoria, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. I trusted Buckley, Victoria, he said. I looked up to him. He was my mentor.
And he used me.
He manipulated me. He made me a part of his scheme, without me even knowing it. He paused, taking a deep breath. And the worst part is, he continued, I suspected something. I saw things, heard things that didn't quite add up. But I dismissed them. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe that the man I respected was capable of such evil. Victoria squeezed his hand, her heart aching for him. She understood his pain, his self-doubt, his sense of betrayal. It's okay, Graham, she said. It's okay to feel this way. But you can't let it define you. You can't let it destroy you. She paused, her gaze meeting his. You need to forgive yourself, Graham, she said. And you need to forgive Buckley. Not for his sake, but for yours. The weight of silence was finally being lifted, replaced by the slow, painful process of healing, of rebuilding trust, of finding a way forward. And Victoria, the woman who had once been so wary of vulnerability, was now his anchor, his guide, his partner in this journey of redemption. Chapter 16. Reckoning. Graham's slow, painful process of confronting his emotions, of acknowledging his guilt and self-doubt, marked a turning point in his healing journey. Victoria's unwavering support, her willingness to listen, to challenge, to simply be there, provided the anchor he needed to navigate the turbulent waters of his inner turmoil. He started talking, sharing his memories of Buckley, his suspicions, his regrets, his anger. He spoke of the cases they had worked on together, the times he had questioned Buckley's methods, the subtle clues he had missed, the red flags he had ignored. He also spoke of his love for Port Sentinel, his commitment to the community, his desire to make amends, to rebuild trust, to earn back the respect he felt he had lost. Victoria listened patiently, offering words of encouragement, of understanding, of forgiveness. She shared her own experiences with her father, her own struggles with trust and betrayal, her own journey to find peace and acceptance. One evening, as they were walking along the beach, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the water, Graham stopped, turning to Victoria. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with emotion. For everything. For not giving up on me. For believing in me. Even when I didn't believe in myself. Victoria smiled, her heart swelling with love for this man, this broken, beautiful man who was slowly, painfully, putting himself back together. You don't have to thank me, Graham, she said. I care about you. And I believe in you. He reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. His touch was warm, reassuring, a silent communication of the bond that had grown between them, a bond forged in danger, strengthened by vulnerability, and deepened by love. I care about you too, Victoria, he said, his voice husky with emotion. More than I ever thought possible. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that expressed the depth of his feelings, the gratitude he felt, the hope that was beginning to blossom within him. The next day, Graham took a significant step. He went to the sheriff's office, not as a deputy, but as a citizen, to offer his assistance in the ongoing investigation into Buckley's crimes. He met with Deputy Hayes, the current sheriff, and offered to share his knowledge of Buckley's methods, his contacts, his hidden agendas. He provided details, insights, and leads that proved invaluable to the investigation, helping to build a stronger case against the former sheriff and his accomplices. He also made a public statement, apologizing to the community for his role, however unintentional, in Buckley's scheme. He acknowledged his mistakes, expressed his remorse, and vowed to work tirelessly to regain their trust, to serve them with integrity and honor. The reaction from the community was mixed. Some were skeptical, their trust still broken, their wounds still raw. But many others were supportive, recognizing Graham's genuine remorse, his willingness to make amends, his commitment to justice. The reckoning wasn't just about Buckley, it was about Graham's own internal reckoning, his confrontation with his past, his acceptance of his mistakes, his determination to move forward, to become a better man, a better public servant, a better partner to Victoria. And as he stood before the community, baring his soul, acknowledging his flaws, he felt a sense of liberation, of release, of a new beginning. The weight of silence had been lifted, replaced by the burden of responsibility, but also by the promise of redemption. Chapter 17, Safe Harbor. Graham's public apology and his active cooperation with the investigation marked a significant turning point, not only for him personally, but also for the community of Port Sentinel. The town, slowly but surely, began to heal, to rebuild trust, to move forward from the shadow of Buckley's betrayal. Graham, while still grappling with the emotional aftermath of his past, found a renewed sense of purpose in his work. He was reinstated as a deputy, albeit with a period of probation and oversight, but he embraced the opportunity to prove himself, to demonstrate his commitment to justice, to serve the community with integrity and honor. He worked closely with Deputy Hayes, sharing his knowledge of the area, his understanding of the people, his insights into the criminal underworld that had, for so long, operated beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful town. He also focused on clearing Carl Weaver's uncle's name, working tirelessly to gather evidence, to interview witnesses, to build a case for exoneration. He felt a personal responsibility to right the wrongs of the past, to bring justice to the man who had been unjustly imprisoned because of Buckley's corruption. Victoria, meanwhile, continued her work as a journalist, writing a series of articles about the Port Sentinel case, exposing the details of the conspiracy, highlighting the courage of those who had come forward, and celebrating the resilience of the community. Her articles garnered national attention, bringing both scrutiny and support to the small town. Their relationship, forged in danger and deepened by shared vulnerability, continued to blossom. They spent their evenings together, cooking meals, taking walks along the beach, talking about their days, their hopes, their dreams. They found solace in each other's company, a sense of peace and belonging that neither of them had expected to find. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch of their rented house, watching the sunset over the harbor, Graham turned to Victoria. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice thoughtful, about the future, about us." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. She had been thinking about the same thing, wondering where their relationship was headed, whether it would last beyond the resolution of the case, beyond their time in Port Sentinel. "What about us?" she asked, her voice soft. He reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, reassuring. "I don't want this to end, Victoria," he said. "I don't want you to go back to Boston. I want you to stay. With me. Here in Port Sentinel." He paused, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I know it's a lot to ask," he continued. "You have your career, your life back in the city. But I can't imagine my life without you now. You've changed me, Victoria. You've made me a better man. And I love you." Victoria's eyes welled up with tears, tears of joy, of relief, of a love that had blossomed in the most unexpected of circumstances. "I love you too, Graham," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And I don't want to go back to Boston. I want to stay with you." They embraced, their hearts overflowing with a love that had been tested by fire, strengthened by adversity, and deepened by shared experience. They had found their safe harbor, not just in the quiet coastal town of Port Sentinel, but in each other's arms. The future was still uncertain, but they knew, with a certainty that transcended all doubts, that they would face it together, with courage, with love, with a commitment to building a life filled with purpose, with meaning, with a happiness that neither of them had ever thought possible. Chapter 18, A gathering storm. Victoria's decision to stay in Port Sentinel marked a new chapter in both their lives. She resigned from her position at the Boston Globe, a decision that surprised many of her colleagues, but one that felt right, inevitable, to her. She had found something in Port Sentinel, something she hadn't realized she was searching for, a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a love that transcended the demands of her career. She and Graham decided to buy a house together, a small, cozy cottage overlooking the harbor, a place where they could build their future, create their own memories, establish their roots in the community. They spent their days renovating the house, painting walls, planting a garden, making it their own. Graham continued his work as a deputy, his reputation restored, his commitment to justice stronger than ever. He was a changed man, more confident, more compassionate, more open to the possibilities of life, of love, of a future he had once thought was beyond his reach. The legal proceedings against Buckley and his accomplices were ongoing, a slow, complex process that involved multiple agencies, numerous witnesses, and a mountain of evidence. Graham and Victoria were both involved in the investigation, providing testimony, sharing information, and supporting Deputy Hayes and her team. But as the case progressed, they began to sense a growing unease, a feeling that not everything was as it seemed. There were whispers in the town, rumors of threats, of intimidation, of witnesses changing their stories. It seemed that Buckley, even from behind bars, still wielded considerable power, that his network of influence extended further than they had initially imagined. One evening, as they were working late at the sheriff's office, reviewing case files, Graham received a phone call. It was an anonymous tip, a whispered warning that someone was planning to disrupt the trial, to silence the witnesses, to ensure that Buckley and his accomplices escaped justice. Graham hung up the phone, his face pale, his expression grim. "Trouble," he said, his voice low. Victoria looked at him, her heart pounding. "What is it?" she asked. "Someone's planning to interfere with the trial," he said, to make sure Buckley walks. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "And I think they're targeting us." Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. The danger they had faced before, the threats they had endured, had not disappeared. They had merely subsided, regrouped, and were now resurfacing, stronger and more menacing than ever. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Graham's expression hardened, his resolve strengthening. "We fight," he said. "We protect the witnesses. We expose the truth. We don't let them win." A gathering storm wasn't just a metaphor, it was a reality. The forces of corruption, of darkness, were gathering, threatening to engulf them, to destroy everything they had worked for. But Victoria and Graham, united by their love, by their commitment to justice, by their shared determination to overcome the past, were ready to face the storm, to protect their community, to secure their future, to ensure that the truth, finally, prevailed. Chapter 19. Night Watch. The anonymous tip about a planned disruption of the trial sent a wave of urgency through the sheriff's department. Deputy Hayes, with Graham's assistance, implemented heightened security measures, increasing patrols, assigning protective details to key witnesses, and coordinating with state and federal agencies. Victoria, despite not being directly involved in law enforcement, felt a responsibility to contribute, to use her skills as a journalist to protect the truth, to expose any attempts to undermine the legal process. She started digging, researching, interviewing, following up on leads, determined to uncover any information that could help prevent the threatened disruption. She and Graham worked closely together, sharing information, strategizing, their combined skills and experience forming a powerful partnership. They spent long hours at the sheriff's office, poring over case files, analyzing phone records, reviewing witness statements, searching for any clue, any hint of who was behind the threat. The pressure was intense, the stakes were high, and the danger was palpable. They knew that they were up against a powerful, well-connected network of individuals who would stop at nothing to protect their interests, to silence their critics, to escape justice. One evening, as they were working late, Victoria noticed something in one of the witness statements, A detail that had been overlooked, a seemingly insignificant connection that suddenly seemed relevant. A witness, a local fisherman, had mentioned seeing a particular type of boat, a rare and expensive model, near Widow's Cove on the night of Arthur Benson's disappearance. The fisherman hadn't thought much of it at the time, but Victoria recognized the boat's description. It matched the type of boat owned by a wealthy and influential businessman, a man named Richard Harding, who had close ties to several of Buckley's known associates. "Graham," she said, her voice excited, "I think I found something." A connection between Buckley and someone even bigger. Graham joined her, his eyes scanning the witness statement, his expression growing increasingly serious. "Harding," he said, his voice low. "Richard Harding. He's been on our radar, but we've never been able to connect him directly to Buckley. This could be the break we need." They decided to investigate further, to follow up on this new lead, to see if they could find any evidence linking Harding to the conspiracy, to the planned disruption of the trial. They knew that they were stepping into dangerous territory, that they were taking on a powerful and ruthless adversary. But they were determined to see this through, to expose the truth, to ensure that justice was served. They decided to keep watch. Knowing that the threat could be imminent, they would take shifts staying up to watch over the town, over the key players involved. They started their first night watch at the lighthouse. It was a good vantage point, a silent guardian. But it was also isolated. And they knew that, this time, the danger wouldn't be a stranger. It would be someone with power, someone with connections, someone who had been hiding in plain sight all along. Chapter 20. The missing piece. The night watch at the lighthouse proved uneventful, but the tension remained high. Victoria and Graham, despite their vigilance, couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something, a crucial piece of the puzzle that would connect Richard Harding to Buckley and the conspiracy. They returned to the sheriff's office, reviewing the evidence again, poring over the witness statements, the phone records, the financial transactions, searching for any overlooked detail, any hidden connection. Victoria, with her journalist's instinct for narrative, focused on the timeline of events, trying to reconstruct the sequence of actions that led to Arthur Benson's murder and the subsequent cover-up. She realized that there was a gap, a missing piece in the story. They knew that Arthur had witnessed the crime, that he had hidden the crates, that he had written about his fear in his logbook. But they didn't know how Buckley had found out about Arthur's knowledge, how he had learned about the logbook, how he had managed to frame Carl Weaver's uncle so effectively. "There has to be someone else," Victoria said, her voice thoughtful. "Someone who knew Arthur, someone he trusted, someone who betrayed him." Graham nodded, his expression grim. "A mole," he said. "Someone on the inside. Someone who fed information to Buckley." They started looking at the people closest to Arthur Benson, his friends, his neighbors, his colleagues. They reviewed their statements, their backgrounds, their connections to Buckley and Harding. And then Victoria saw it. A name that appeared repeatedly in the old records, a name that had been mentioned in passing by several witnesses, a name that had, until now, seemed insignificant. Martha, the innkeeper. The kindly, matronly woman who had welcomed Victoria to Port Sentinel, who had offered her tea and sympathy, who had seemed so genuinely concerned. Victoria remembered Martha's evasiveness when she had asked about Arthur's disappearance, her knowing look, her subtle emphasis on certain words. She remembered Martha's mentioning that everyone knew Arthur and that he was a good man after Victoria asked about his disappearance. "Graham," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I think it was Martha. I think she was involved." Graham's eyes widened in disbelief. "Martha?" he said. "But she's been so helpful. So kind." "That's what makes her so dangerous," Victoria said. "She's the last person anyone would suspect. She's the perfect mole. She has access to information, to gossip, to the comings and goings of everyone in town." They reviewed Martha's background, searching for any connection to Buckley or Harding. And they found it. A financial transaction, a large sum of money transferred from a shell company controlled by Harding to Martha's bank account a few weeks after Arthur Benson's disappearance. The missing piece had been found. Martha, the seemingly harmless innkeeper, was the link between Arthur Benson and his murderers. She had been the one who had betrayed him, who had provided Buckley with the information he needed to silence him, to cover up his crimes. The weight of this realization was crushing. The person who had offered comfort and a safe harbor had, all along, been part of the storm. Chapter 21. Face to face the revelation that Martha, the seemingly kind and helpful innkeeper, was involved in Arthur Benson's murder, and the subsequent cover-up was a devastating blow. Victoria and Graham felt the mixture of shock, disbelief, and a profound sense of betrayal. The woman who had offered them comfort and support had, all along, been a part of the conspiracy they were trying to unravel. They knew they needed to confront Martha, to gather evidence, to bring her to justice. But they also knew that they needed to be careful. Martha was clearly cunning and resourceful, and she had managed to conceal her involvement for decades. They decided to approach her indirectly, to avoid alerting her to their suspicions. They planned to visit the seafarer's rest as if nothing had changed, to engage her in casual conversation, to subtly probe for information, to see if they could get her to reveal something, anything, that would confirm their suspicions. They arrived at the inn, finding Martha behind the counter, arranging flowers in a vase. She greeted them with her usual warm smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Victoria, Graham," she said, her voice welcoming. "What brings you here? More questions about Arthur?" Victoria forced a smile, trying to appear relaxed and natural. "Just checking in, Martha," she said. "We've been reviewing the case files, and well, we were wondering if you remembered anything else. Anything at all that might be helpful." Martha's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of something nervousness crossing her face. "I've told you everything I know," she said, her voice a little too. Graham stepped forward, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Martha," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "we know about the money. The money you received from Harding's company." Martha's face paled. Her composure crumbled, her carefully constructed facade shattered. She stared at them, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice trembling. Victoria pressed on, her journalist's instincts taking over. "We know you were in contact with Buckley, Martha," she said. "We know you provided him with information about Arthur, about his logbook, about his suspicions." Martha's silence was her confession. She didn't deny it, didn't try to explain, didn't try to defend herself. She simply stood there, her body trembling, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. "Why, Martha?" Victoria asked, her voice filled with a mix of anger and sadness. "Why did you do it?" Martha finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. He threatened me," she said.
Buckley.
He said he'd hurt my family if I didn't cooperate." She paused, tears welling up in her eyes. I didn't know he was going to kill Arthur," she said. I just wanted to protect my family." Her confession, though coerced, was a crucial piece of the puzzle. It confirmed her involvement, her motive, her connection to Buckley and Harding. Graham moved to arrest Martha, his expression grim, his heart heavy with the weight of this betrayal. As he was reading her rights, Martha looked at Victoria, her eyes pleading. "I'm sorry, Victoria," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Victoria looked at her, her feelings a complex mix of anger, pity, and a profound sense of sadness. She had trusted Martha, had confided in her, had considered her a friend. And all along, she had been betrayed. The face-to-face confrontation wasn't just about gathering evidence, it was about confronting the human cost of the conspiracy, the ripple effect of betrayal, the devastating consequences of choices made out of fear, out of desperation, out of a misguided sense of self-preservation. And as Martha was led away in handcuffs, Victoria knew that the healing process for Port Sentinel and for herself would be long and difficult. Chapter 22. The unforgiven Martha's arrest and confession sent another shockwave through Port Sentinel. The community, already reeling from Buckley's betrayal, now had to grapple with the duplicity of one of their own, a woman who had been a trusted member of their community, a seemingly harmless innkeeper who had, for years, harbored a dark secret. The news of Martha's involvement also had a profound impact on Graham. He had known Martha for years, had considered her friend, a reliable source of information. He had trusted her, and her betrayal cut him deeply, adding another layer to the emotional wounds he was already carrying. He found himself questioning his judgment again, his ability to read people, to assess character. He wondered how he could have been so blind, how he could have missed the signs, the clues, that Martha was not who she seemed to be. Victoria, seeing Graham's renewed struggle, tried to offer him comfort, to reassure him that he wasn't to blame, that Martha had been a master manipulator, that she had fooled everyone. But Graham remained withdrawn, his guilt and self-doubt resurfacing, his spirit once again burdened by the weight of the past. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch of their house, overlooking the now familiar harbor, Victoria decided to confront him directly. "Graham," she said, her voice firm but gentle, "you need to stop this. You need to stop blaming yourself. Martha's choices were her own. You are not responsible for her actions." Graham didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the sky met the sea. "You've done everything right, Graham," Victoria continued. "You've helped uncover a conspiracy. You've brought criminals to justice. You've cleared an innocent man's name. You should be proud of yourself, not drowning in guilt." Graham finally turned to her, his eyes filled with a pain that she had come to recognize, a pain that she knew all too well. "I keep seeing her face, Victoria," he said, his voice hoarse. "Martha's face. Smiling, offering me coffee, asking about my day. And all the while she was lying. She was betraying us all." He paused, his voice cracking slightly.
I trusted her, Victoria.
"I trusted her. And I feel like a fool." Victoria reached out, taking his hand in hers. His touch was cold, his grip weak. "You're not a fool, Graham," she said. "You're human. You're allowed to trust people. You're allowed to be wrong. It's what makes us human." She paused, her gaze meeting his. "And, she added, her voice softer now, "there's something else that makes us human. The ability to forgive. To forgive others, and to forgive ourselves." Graham looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if looking for an answer, for a way out of the darkness that had enveloped him. "I don't know if I can forgive her, Victoria," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Or myself." "You don't have to do it all at once," Victoria said. "It's a process. It takes time. But you need to start. For your own sake. And for ours." The unforgiven wasn't just Martha, it was Graham himself. He was holding on to his guilt, his self-reproach, his sense of failure, refusing to let go, refusing to move on. And Victoria knew that until he could forgive himself, until he could accept his past and embrace the future, their relationship, their love, their shared life, would remain shadowed by the weight of his unspoken pain. She could offer him love, support, and understanding. But the final step, the act of forgiveness, was something he had to do on his own. Chapter 23. New Light. The process of healing, both for Graham and for the community of Port Sentinel, was slow and gradual. The scars of Buckley's and Martha's betrayals ran deep, and the rebuilding of trust would take time, effort, and a willingness to confront the past and embrace the future. Graham, with Victoria's unwavering support, began to take steps towards forgiving himself. He started attending therapy sessions, talking through his emotions, processing his guilt, and learning coping mechanisms to deal with the lingering trauma of his past experiences. He also rededicated himself to his work as a deputy, throwing himself into his duties with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to serve the community with integrity and honor, to earn back the trust he felt he had lost. He worked closely with Deputy Hayes, assisting in the ongoing investigation, ensuring that all the loose ends were tied up, that all those involved in the conspiracy were brought to justice. He made it a personal mission to see that Carl Weaver's uncle was exonerated, his name cleared, his reputation restored. Victoria, meanwhile, continued her work as a journalist, but she shifted her focus from investigative reporting to community building. She started writing stories about the positive aspects of Port Sentinel, highlighting the resilience of its residents, the beauty of its landscape, the strength of its community spirit. She also became actively involved in local initiatives, volunteering at the library, organizing community events, and working to promote tourism and economic development in the town. She wanted to help rebuild Port Sentinel, not just physically, but also emotionally, to create a sense of hope, of optimism, of a future free from the shadows of the past. Their relationship, tested by adversity and strengthened by shared vulnerability, continued to deepen. They found solace in each other's company, a sense of peace and belonging that neither of them had ever expected to find. They learned to communicate more openly, to share their fears and insecurities, to support each other through the difficult times. One evening, as they were standing on the balcony of the lighthouse, watching the beams sweep across the dark waters, Graham turned to Victoria. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice thoughtful, about Arthur, about his logbook, about all the lives he touched, even after his death. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "He was a lonely man, Victoria," he continued. "But he wasn't a bad man. He tried to do the right thing. He tried to protect the truth. And in the end, he succeeded, even though it cost him his life." Victoria nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and respect for her uncle, the man she had never really known, but whose legacy had so profoundly shaped her life. "We should do something," Graham said, his voice firm. "To honor him, to remember him, to make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain." Victoria smiled, her eyes shining with a new light, a light of hope, of purpose, of a future built on the foundations of the past. "I agree," she said. "Let's do something. Let's make this lighthouse a beacon of hope, a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of truth." The new light wasn't just the beam of the lighthouse, it was the light of understanding, of forgiveness, of a renewed commitment to justice and community. It was the light of a future built on the lessons of the past, a future where the secrets of Sentinel's light would no longer cast a shadow, but would instead illuminate the path towards healing, towards reconciliation, towards a new beginning. Chapter 24. Bearing witness. Inspired by their conversation at the lighthouse, Helen and Graham decided to create a small museum dedicated to Arthur Benson and the history of Sentinel's light. They envisioned a space where visitors could learn about the lighthouse's role in maritime navigation, about Arthur's life and sacrifice, and about the recent events that had shaken Port Sentinel to its core. They secured permission to use a portion of the lighthouse's ground floor for the museum, and they began gathering artifacts, photographs, and documents that would tell the story. They worked closely with the local historical society, with Carl Weaver and Sarah from the previous romance story, and with other members of the community who had memories of Arthur or knowledge of the lighthouse's history. The process of creating the museum was cathartic for both Helen and Graham. It allowed them to channel their grief, their anger, their sense of betrayal into something positive, something constructive, something that would honor Arthur's memory and educate future generations. For Graham, it was also a way to make amends, to atone for his past mistakes, to demonstrate his commitment to the truth, to the community he had sworn to serve. He poured his heart and soul into the project, spending countless hours researching, organizing, and designing the exhibits. Victoria, with her journalist skills, wrote the text for the displays, crafting a narrative that was both informative and emotionally resonant. She told the story of Arthur's life, his solitary existence, his unwavering dedication to his duty, and his ultimate sacrifice. She also told the story of the recent events, of the conspiracy, of the betrayals, of the fight for justice, of the community's resilience. The museum's centerpiece was Arthur's logbook, carefully preserved and displayed in a glass case. It was a powerful symbol of the truth, a testament to the courage of one man who had dared to stand up against corruption, even at the cost of his own life. The museum's opening was a major event for Port Sentinel. The entire community turned out, eager to see the culmination of Helen and Graham's efforts to honor Arthur Benson's memory and to celebrate the town's resilience. Deputy Hayes gave a speech, praising Helen and Graham for their dedication, for their commitment to justice, for their role in bringing healing and closure to the community. Carl Weaver, whose uncle had finally been exonerated, also spoke, expressing his gratitude to Helen and Graham, to the community that had supported him, to the memory of Arthur Benson, the man who had, indirectly, saved his uncle's life. Graham, standing beside Victoria, felt a sense of peace, of accomplishment, of having finally found redemption. He had faced his demons, he had confronted his past, he had made amends, and he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more committed to the truth than ever before. As Victoria stepped forward to speak, she looked out at the crowd, at the faces of the people she had come to know and love, at the community that had welcomed her, at the lighthouse that had become her home. "We are here today," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "to bear witness. To bear witness to the courage of one man, Arthur Benson, who dared to stand up against corruption. To bear witness to the resilience of this community, which has overcome adversity and emerged stronger. And to bear witness to the power of truth, which, even when buried for decades, can eventually find its way to the light." She paused, her gaze meeting Graham's, her heart filled with love and gratitude. "This lighthouse," she continued, "is more than just a beacon for ships. It's a beacon of hope, a symbol of justice, a testament to the enduring human spirit. And it's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the light of truth can always prevail." The applause was thunderous, a wave of appreciation and respect that washed over Helen and Graham, a confirmation that they had not only solved a mystery and brought criminals to justice, but they had also helped to heal a community, to restore faith, to create a lasting legacy of hope and resilience. They were no longer just bearing witness to the past, they were building a future together. Chapter 25. Illumination. The museum at Sentinels Light became a success, drawing visitors from all over the state and even beyond. It served not only as a tribute to Arthur Benson and a repository of local history, but also as a symbol of Port Sentinel's resilience, a testament to the community's ability to overcome adversity and emerge stronger. The legal proceedings against Buckley and his accomplices concluded, with most of the key players receiving lengthy prison sentences. Richard Harding, the wealthy businessman who had been the mastermind behind the conspiracy, was also convicted, his empire crumbling around him, his reputation destroyed. Justice, though delayed, had finally been served. Carl Weaver's uncle was formally exonerated, his name cleared, his record expunged. He received a substantial settlement from the state, a small compensation for the years he had unjustly spent behind bars. Carl, who had been instrumental in uncovering the truth, became a local hero, a symbol of perseverance and the importance of fighting for what's right. Martha, the former innkeeper, pleaded guilty to her role in the conspiracy, receiving a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation. She expressed deep remorse for her actions, acknowledging the pain she had caused and seeking forgiveness from the community she had betrayed. While many in Port Sentinel struggled to forgive her, Graham, after a long and difficult internal struggle, found it within himself to do so. He visited her in prison, not to offer comfort, but to understand, to hear her story, to close that chapter of his life. He realized that forgiveness was not about condoning her actions, but about releasing himself from the burden of anger and resentment. As for Helen and Graham, their lives settled into a peaceful, fulfilling rhythm. They continued to live in their cozy cottage overlooking the harbor, their days filled with love, laughter, and a shared commitment to their community. Victoria continued her writing, focusing on local stories, on celebrating the beauty and resilience of the Maine coast and its people. She found a sense of purpose and satisfaction in her work, a connection to her new home that transcended her previous career ambitions. Graham, fully restored to his position as a deputy, became a mentor to younger officers, sharing his experience, his wisdom, and his unwavering commitment to justice. He was a changed man, more compassionate, more understanding, more aware of the complexities of human nature, and more determined than ever to serve and protect his community. One evening, as they were standing on the balcony of the lighthouse, watching the beams sweep across the dark waters, just as they had done many times before, Graham turned to Victoria. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "I used to hate this place. This lighthouse. It represented everything I had lost. My career, my mentor, my faith in people." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "But now I see it differently. It's a symbol of hope, of resilience, of second chances. Victoria smiled, her heart overflowing with love for this man, this community, this life they had built together. "It's a beacon, Graham," she said. "A beacon of light, guiding us home." He reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, familiar, a constant reassurance of their enduring love. "And you," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "You're my beacon, Victoria. You brought light back into my life. You showed me that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope. There's always a chance for redemption, for love." They stood there, silhouetted against the night sky, the lighthouse beams sweeping across the water, a silent guardian, a symbol of their journey, of their love, of their shared commitment to a future filled with light. The illumination wasn't just from the lamp, it was from within them, from the love they shared, from the peace they had found, from the future they were building together. The secrets of Sentinels' light had been revealed, the darkness had been dispelled, and in its place, a new light had emerged, brighter and stronger than ever before. Epilogue. 5 years later, 5 years had passed, and the scars of the past had faded, replaced by the gentle patina of time and healing. Port Sentinel had regained its peaceful rhythm, the memories of Buckley's betrayal and Martha's duplicity receding into the annals of local history. The lighthouse, with its small museum, stood as a constant reminder of the town's resilience, a beacon of hope and a testament to the enduring power of truth. Helen and Graham were sitting on the porch of their cozy cottage, enjoying the late afternoon sun. Their hair had more silver now, their faces bore a few more lines, but their eyes still sparkled with the same love, the same contentment, the same shared joy that had blossomed amidst the turmoil of their early days in Port Sentinel. 7-year-old Thomas, named after Victoria's father but bearing a striking resemblance to his grandfather, Arthur Benson, was playing in the garden, his laughter echoing through the quiet afternoon air. He was a bright, inquisitive child, fascinated by the sea, by the lighthouse, by the stories of his namesake uncle. Victoria was working on a new book, a collection of essays about the people and places of the Maine coast. She had found her niche, her voice, her purpose in telling the stories of this rugged, beautiful land and its resilient inhabitants. Graham, now retired from the sheriff's department, spent his days volunteering at the Lighthouse Museum, sharing his knowledge of local history, his insights into the events that had shaped their lives, and his unwavering belief in the power of justice and redemption. He had become a mentor to young people in the community, a guiding light, a symbol of integrity and resilience. As they watched Thomas play, Helen reached out, taking Graham's hand in hers. Their touch was familiar, comforting, a silent communication of the enduring bond that had grown between them, a bond forged in danger, strengthened by adversity, and deepened by a love that had defied the odds. "Remember that first day?" Helen said, her voice soft, a smile playing on her lips, "when I arrived in Port Sentinel. I was so determined to sell the lighthouse, to go back to Boston, to escape." Graham chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "And I thought you were just another nosy journalist, poking around in things that didn't concern you." "Well, I am a nosy journalist," Victoria said, playfully. "But I'm glad I poked around."
I'm glad I stayed.
"Me too," Graham said, his voice filled with emotion. You changed my life, Victoria. You brought light back into it. You gave me a reason to believe again." He paused, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes shining with a love that had only deepened with time. "And you gave me Thomas," he added, his voice husky with emotion. "Our miracle." Their late-in-life child was a constant reminder of the unexpected blessings that life could offer, of the power of love to transform and to heal, of the enduring hope for new beginnings, even after the most challenging of times. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the harbor, Thomas ran up to them, his face flushed with excitement. "Grandpa Graham," he exclaimed, "can we go to the lighthouse?"
Can we see the light?
Graham smiled, his heart overflowing with love for this child, for this life, for this woman who had brought so much joy into his world. "Of course, we can, Thomas," he said. Let's go see the light. And as they walked towards the lighthouse, hand in hand, the three of them, a family forged in the crucible of adversity, their love a beacon shining brightly against the darkening sky, they knew that they were home. The secrets were gone, the storm had passed, and their future, illuminated by love and strengthened by resilience, stretched before them, filled with endless possibilities.